Tune in to the Onyx Report, a bi-weekly analysis of how black males of all stripes experience American society and navigate misandry. Join me, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State and founder of the concept of Black Masculinism, to examine the issues that impact the lives of black males, from history to politics, media to policy, spirituality to economics. Join me to explore the hidden stories of black men and boys, and we'll discern them from the stories imposed on them. Listen to the Onyx Report live on innerlightradio.com every first and third Wednesday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, and 8 p.m. Eastern. Check out episodes on demand at your convenience on my website at www.thasanjohnson.com. Also find me on Facebook at facebook.com/dr.hassanj, Twitter at twitter.com/Lord Hasan, YouTube at Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, and finally my Black Masculinist blog at www.newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. Welcome to the Onyx Report, a program that critically analyzes the experiences, histories, and perceptions of black males in American society. I'm Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State, black male advocate, and black male studies scholar. In the program, we examine current events while engaging concepts ranging from institutionalized anti-black misandry to gynocentrism from a black masculinist perspective. Our goal is to remind people of black men's humanity. Call in after a half hour to the show at 310-928-7733. All right. Welcome back to the Onyx Report with Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. We are first and third Wednesdays of each month, so it's good to be back. Today we're going to be dealing with the subject, or I should say, of this today's show is black men, their silent mobilization, and the Joker, framing the black masculinist movement. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that soon enough. But as you know, if you've been a listener, this is our, ninth episode. But what I like to do is start with some of the current events just to kind of frame a little bit about a black masculinist perspective while also giving a sense of where we are in the current moment. So since the last show, one of the major things that's been in the news has been the death of one Tatiana Jefferson in Fort Worth, Texas, a young black woman killed by a police officer who was called in to investigate by a neighbor the condition of the house, what may have been happening. I think there was a front door open. Nevertheless, the police officer came around the back and apparently shot her, and they're currently debating about whether or not she had a gun and or aimed it at him first, which is really strange considering that if she was in the home babysitting and heard a noise, that even if she was, potentially defending herself, apparently the officer didn't make his presence known. So either way, there's definitely going to be an investigation. The officer, to my knowledge, has stepped down, but at the end of the day, there's much more to be dealt with, especially after the recent killing of one Botham Jean, also in Texas, by a white female officer who came into his home claiming that she mistook it for hers and shot him while he sat on his couch eating ice cream. So these cases need to be drawn out and examined, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, all considering. But peace to the Jefferson family in regard to Tatiana herself. Another article that was out, I also posted in my social media, was the 1995 murder conviction of one Anthony Lemons in Cleveland, Ohio. His conviction was overturned after the court found that prosecutors withheld evidence during his trial, and he was wrongfully imprisoned. And I try to point these out as regularly as I can because they seem to be quite constant, especially in regard to black men. And that's mainly because black men are one of the only groups, if not the preeminent group, that can be charged with a crime strictly on the basis of being black and male. And that often holds up enough for men to do decades in prison. And that's if he's exonerated at all. It has nothing to do with innocence per se, but whether or not he's exonerated has nothing to do with it, meaning that he's lucky to have been exonerated, but how many more black men are incarcerated unjustly and were arrested and successfully incarcerated simply on the basis of being black and male, right? And so these kind of cases keep revealing to us how easy that is. And most black men that I speak to who are aware of their status in society are concerned about that on a regular basis. It's nothing that ever really leaves the consciousness, knowing whether you're driving your car, whether you're at the store, or whether you're walking around in your own home. There's really not a moment where you might not find yourself victim to any host of things that can take place, and the public can soon lose interest or forget about you altogether if they know about you at all. We may hear about Anthony Lemons, we may hear about Botham Jean, but at the end of the day, or Jean, but at the end of the day, there are many more black men who've been killed and incarcerated whose names we don't know. And that also goes for police and vigilante killings as a whole. There's roughly about 200 to 300 black men killed per year by police and vigilante violence, and yet we only know of a couple that we hear about in the news. Usually, if you ask the average person, they may know about 4 or 5 black men, but that'll be over the course of a couple years. But the other 200 to 300 that died in that same time period often go without discussion, without reflection. So we need to keep in mind that that's definitely taking place. And at the same time, there are about 8 to 20 black women per year that are killed by police officers and vigilante justice as well. So these are things that definitely have to be talked about, but there's without question something unique that's happening to black men. And so I like to keep that in the forefront because a lot of people like to bury that and make it about something else. Another report from theguardian.com to check out is that Los Angeles seems to be the one of the cities where the only people that get death sentences are people of color. So check that out in The Guardian. Because that says a lot. And based on the incarceration rates, where we know as recently as 2013, we saw over 900,000 black men incarcerated. That number has gone down a couple 100,000, but these are not men that have been, arrested at a lesser rate. They've just really been sent home with ankle bracelets. So the rates are still extremely high for the population. And yet, at the end of the day, we can, ascertain that those who are headed to death sentences in terms of the black community would overwhelmingly be men based on that alone. I think there's about over 200,000 women incarcerated, about 700,000 plus black men alone. So that in and of itself tells us who's getting the death sentences. But interesting article to look into. Also, a recent one having to do with the police killer of Terrence Crutcher. This police officer too, just like Jean, was a white female, and apparently former Tulsa, Oklahoma cop Betty Jo Shelby, who killed Crutcher last September, will have his shooting expunged from her record. And this is interesting that this is happening to Tulsa, Oklahoma, or in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because we've definitely seen in the last century that there's been enough black death in that city in particular, but yet she might be able to get this off her record. And this is happening in another case as well. So this kind of thing that's taking place is shifting the focus onto the officer and the hardships they face finding work, and yet we're not talking about the fact that these people who they've killed have lost their lives entirely. So your current difficulty finding work is not our concern. Our concern is keeping the focus on the people who are unjustly killed. So that's something else to pay attention to. Also, an article on convicted homelessness. And this was by CBS12.com. This is an article talking about convicted felons who end up homeless due to criminal background policies, in terms of apartments and housing, in terms of people being able to have an opportunity to be rented to. And this is something we need to keep an eye on, because much of the homelessness that we're seeing, particularly in Southern and Central California, we can definitely see being related to black men, especially black men that have had any, experience in the prison industrial complex. So we know that in Los Angeles, the city is about 2% black male, but over 60% of the homeless are black men as well. And I can guarantee you that this is part of that factor, convicted homelessness. But, or I should say convicted felons who end up homeless. But this is not just limited to felons. I will say that. I had a conversation online about this, where I was talking to someone who had experience, who had come out of prison and was talking about how difficult it was to secure housing. And I said, the irony of that is I live in Fresno, right? I'm an associate professor at Fresno State. I have moved twice. I've moved here once from Claremont when I first picked up my position here at Fresno State in Africana Studies, and then I moved maybe 5 years later in my neighborhood, right? And the interesting thing about it is in both instances, I applied at over 50 different places, doctorate in hand, job in hand, long-term career in hand, all of that. And I had to apply and got denied in over 49 of those places. It's usually the very last one where I actually was able to successfully get in. And it actually got worse after my wife passed. So when I would walk into these places alone, it got even worse. And occasionally when I would bring my son, well, he's 14 and 6'5" now, but even at the time when he was 5, 6 years old, he was big, big for his age. And even if I brought him, it didn't change anything. Whereas when he was a baby and I would walk in with my wife, sometimes there would be places that would, engage us. But I can say each time I moved, it was difficult. With a doctorate and a guaranteed job in hand, it didn't make a difference. So, some of this I definitely think has to do with our convicted status, but even black men who have followed the rules, who've done as they've been told, who have achieved some degree of success or whatever you want to call it, there's still difficulties there, right? And at the same time, I know at any point one can be arrested for something and spend a little more time in jail than they plan. There are articles I was talking about last year in class where young men were going to jail on traffic violations that they had not paid, ended up getting in a fight in jail, protecting themselves, and spending a month to a couple months in prison or in jail. And by the time they got out, had lost their job, sometimes their housing altogether, over something that they weren't particularly guilty of. So being black and male in this context in terms of housing and homelessness definitely plays a role, whether convict or not. But there's no question that those who've been convicted in the past, the ex-cons, are probably grappling with the worst of this. So something to keep in mind as you see the increasing number of homeless while you drive around. Two more pieces that I want to jump into very quickly. One, related to the recent announcement by one Angela Bassett of having been molested as a child. This comes right before Tisha Campbell, actress who starred in a number of things, one of them being the show, the sitcom Martin. She came out as well on a TV One episode of Uncensored, and she talked about having been molested and sexually assaulted at a young age. And both of these women's stories coming forward are incredibly important, incredibly necessary, and at least in, actually I think in both situations, but definitely in Angela Bassett's situation, her mother believed her, which went a great deal, which helped her a great deal in terms of being believed and supported. I can say, however, for many black males, that's often not the case, be they celebrity or not. And I want to impress upon us that this is a dynamic that's been happening for an untold period of time. But for the most part, black men have not really been included in that discourse, and they need to on a regular basis. So this is something that I want you to keep in mind, even with celebrities. I list out in one of my blog pieces just a few of the black male celebrities that have come forward in recent years to talk about the fact that they had been molested or sexually assaulted at a young age, and there's no real public acknowledgement. So you have figures like Ike Turner, Sugar Ray Leonard, Iceberg Slim, R. Kelly, MC Shan, Chris Brown, Bow Wow, D. Ray Davis, Lil Wayne, Tyler Perry, Columbus Short, Charlemagne the God, Mike Tyson, Antoine Fisher, Kashif, the R&B singer, DMX, Lecrae, Denzel Curry, Chris Gardner, Don Lemon, Rasan Patterson, Terry Crews. Terry Crews was not during childhood, as many of you know. This is just a couple years ago, I believe, where he was groped at a party. But the point is that black males experience this, even celebrities, and yet many of us don't talk about it. And so these kind of things need to make it on the record. And lastly, in terms of current events, there's an article that came out on NBC News about suicide, black suicide in particular. And it's written by Nick Charles, October 8th, and it deals with black girls and black boys. One of the interesting results is as follows. It says a recent study in the Journal of Community Health showed that suicide rates among black girls ages 13 to 19 doubled from 2001 to 2017. For black boys in the same age group over the same period, the rates rose over 60%, or rates rose 60%. So I think that's incredibly telling, that there are things going on with black males that we often don't know how to talk about. And sometimes when we reduce this to an issue of just black suicide, we really, in an attempt to not offend anybody, we kind of sweep under the rug a glaring issue that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed directly and full-throatedly. That this is an issue that black males are facing in unprecedented numbers that needs to be grappled with, needs to be dealt with head-on, and really shouldn't be tiptoed through. We need to actually deal with what's going on with black males. Now, in terms of suicide, one of the tropes that we know over the last number of years is that even across race, women attempt suicide in much higher numbers than men. Men complete suicide in much higher numbers than women. And these numbers hold true even in the black community. So in terms of the suicidology.org, one of the most recent 2017 reports, it says that as of 2017, it looks like there are about 641 black women who've been killed, who've committed suicide, and over 2,421 black males. Again, we need to be able to explore what's going on, but again, we also have to be full-throated about addressing our boys, which is interesting because the recent GQ article on new black masculinities presents the problem of toxic masculinity and suggests a solution. And this is not a surprising solution for the most part, dealing with these new definitions of progressive masculinities that are very affirming and very influenced by feminist engagements, feminist conceptualizations of what masculinity should be. And yet, at the end of the day, we're going to talk about toxic masculinities and ignore the increased suicide rates, the increased incarceration rates, the increased dropout rates, the increased penalization rates of K through 12 black male students. I can go on, and we're going to ignore all of that while talking about toxic masculinity. So these are some of the problems that frame the current moment. And so, wanting to deal with this movement that I've identified, that I'm referring to as a Black Masculinist movement, this is something I wrote about a number of years ago in my first book. In the first book, I was dealing with hip-hop, and I basically did for the hip-hop class I was teaching. And one of the things I realized is that when I wrote the book, I based portions of it off my dissertation. When I was writing about Black masculinism, I actually came to the conclusion that I really hadn't reflected theoretically on black men. I had only learned to do so with black women. So from undergrad, from 1992 to 2007, all the way through my doctorate, the only time we had discussed gender with any degree of specificity, theoretically speaking, is again in regard to women and strictly along black feminist lines. I had not reflected on black men. And so when writing my book on hip hop, when I got to I think I actually had 3 sections on gender. 2 of them ended up being about black women. And when I got to black men, I didn't have anything comparable to say with the same level of detail. And so that was my first introduction to me on how much was lacking. So I ended up kind of diving in over the years, and it helped me kind of expand and push through. Nevertheless, today's episode is inspired by 3 pieces of media that I had a chance to deal with in the last week. The first of which was the article by GQ on new black masculinities I mentioned a moment ago. And the other 2 were films. I just saw The Joker the night it came out, actually. And so that was one of the inspirations. for tonight, as well as a throwback film from 1973, I believe, Claudine. And I watched it. I even showed it in one of my classes, partly in honor of the recently passed Diane Carroll, but also to really engage some of the issues that the film Claudine brings back up. Suffice it to say, I forgot that Gladys Knight, and I mean, she sang an incredible soundtrack to the film, and I mean, is the embodiment of sexy in terms of 1973. If you go back and listen to that soundtrack, she's ridiculous. And the only song I can think of, you know, sexier than the makings of you is probably Mavis Staples' Let's Do It Again. But anyway, watching Claudine, I actually saw some things in the film that kind of threw me, because I'd been watching that film most of my life, but I had not reflected on it from the standpoint of an adult black male. And so in the film, even though there is a song actually, you know, entitled Stay Away from Welfare, but despite that, the whole film really was a call for black men to, you know, despite the new and developing welfare state in 1973, to marry nonetheless. So James Earl Jones plays Roop, who is in love with Diane Carroll's Claudine, but she has 6 kids. He has 3 of his own, and if he marries her, he's of course responsible for all 9. And so that was the thrust of the film, and I didn't realize how much of that was pushing black men, despite what it could do to them at the time and to this moment. And so watching it as an adult and as a masculinist, I noticed that the dangers for Roop, he is well aware of, but others kind of dismiss. And there are several points in the film where there are shaming tactics used to condemn black men who question whether or not jumping in and being, you know, responsible for 6 kids that are not biologically his, if, you know, they shamed him for questioning it, let alone if he didn't do it, if he didn't step up and marry her. And there were moments where they directly stated that this is really a question of her worth, rather than any kind of reflection on whether or not he's justified in trying to decide. Because the interesting thing about it is, if he got divorced, if they divorced even, you know, a couple years later, he could be responsible. He could continue to be responsible for children that aren't necessarily his either. And of course, the withdrawing of welfare support in line with the man in the house rule, meaning that there would be reduced welfare if there's a man that she's associated with. So these kind of things I'm noticing were even, you know, shamed in 1973. And so it got me to kind of thinking. But by the time we get to the Joker, something interesting happens, you know, because it's a highly controversial film right now, but it's mainly controversial because it's dealing with a conflation between mental health as well as protests about you know, the political disenfranchisement, about the elite and the poor. And so the kind of conflating of the two in the body, particularly of one white male played by Joaquin Phoenix, and this kind of what people feared would be, you know, a dramatizing, a sensationalizing of violence. And one can argue that any violence shown in media is in some form sensationalized, but I think the film deals with some other issues that are relevant even to black men, because at the end of the day, Arthur Fleck, played by Phoenix, who becomes the Joker, is really representative of something that America hasn't come to grips with, and that's the vulnerability of men. Right? It's controversial because this is coming out from, you know, a poor white male with mental health issues, but in many ways it mirrors the experiences of black men in terms of being social outcasts. Being outcast on almost every metric. And so there are parallels to be really looked at. And the nihilism of the film as it relates to what some men grapple with in terms of being unwanted, unsupported, these kind of things become extremely important in regard to what exactly men experience. So with that, one of the issues I wanted to get to. So with that, one of the issues I wanted to get to with black males in particular and we can relate this to Joker. There will be some light spoilers, but I'm not really going to do an in-depth because I still want people to see it. And if you'd like to engage it a little more, you're welcome to call in as well. But at the end of the day, one of the issues we're dealing with, I'm sorry, the call-in number is 310-928-7733. I'm getting a beeping in my earphone. I'm not sure what this refers to. Anyway, so part of what we're dealing with when we talk about mental health, when we talk about black men as social outcasts, the way it kind of relates to the film is that Fleck plays, in some instances, a figure that's reminiscent of, black men as outcasts, but the primary difference is he's not seen as a threat on sight. He's problematized as a threat in terms of his behavior, and nobody really, examines why. And he's being beat up, he's being attacked arbitrarily, he's taking care of a mother with mental illness that has lied to him about his own upbringing. So he's grappling with all of these things, and yet, at the end of the day, he's seen as innocent, if not invisible. Whereas black men who experience the same kind of dynamics are often still treated as a threat, whether they are or they aren't, simply on the basis of how they're seen, strictly off the top. So these kind of elements come into play in ways that I think merit reflection. And so I even urge people to see the film and really think about the ways, that it invokes black males in terms of outcast status, even without calling black males out by name. But again, it does contradict the kind of, narratives on male supremacy, male privilege, things of that nature, and not necessarily any in-depth reflection in terms of how society sees men as vulnerable. And so we even see that with black males doubly so, where black males being vulnerable is something people have a difficult time ingesting and taking seriously. And I think that this merits it, especially considering that when he really becomes a threat toward the end of the film, where he shoots Robert De Niro's character, the talk show host. And this is very much, related to some of the past films. The film is inspired by, even starring Robert De Niro, but I don't want to go down that track at the moment. He actually plans to kill himself. There's a moment where he's contemplating suicide, and he actually practices the gesture of shooting himself in the head, but it's upon responding to Robert De Niro's character and the kind of misframing of the nihilism that's going on that he decides at the last moment to attack him. But what I'm seeing there is still a relationship between this kind of outcast status and, not being heard, not being seen, and being mischaracterized. And I think there are some parallels that merit discussion. So tonight, in talking about the Black Masculinist movement, I wanted to first frame what it is, how it functions, and why it is. Black masculinism is a concept that, yes, I developed and I've talked about, especially on my blog, where I deal with what masculinism means, what black masculinism means, why it's necessary to actually analyze phenomena historically and contemporarily from a black male standpoint. I do advocate for that, but understand, this movement with black men has been happening long before the term has been coined. In other words, movements are a response to conditions, whether they are named or not. And in this instance, in regard to black men, especially from the 1960s to the 1970s, black men began responding to society, their social role in it, the social expectations put upon them. They began even then. And this is kind of what Claudine brought up for me as well. And I talked about this in class after we watched the film, because it's at this time that we have a cross section of things taking place that impact black males in the 1970s. Some of them stem from the 1960s, but they definitely come into play in the 1970s. So the impact, for example, of the Vietnam and Korean Wars, on black men themselves, and relationships with black women, right? The impact of that, the shift in terms of birth control, whereas to this day, for the most part, men are still locked in the 1950s in terms of birth control options, whereas at that time period, women were really starting to get theirs. As a matter of fact, Roe v. Wade was filed 3 years before Claudine. So it's actually in the year Claudine comes out that the judgment is levied on Roe v. Wade. So this is a changing time period for women to be able to gain greater control over their own biology in ways that men are not able to do. And so these kind of change dynamics as well. We have, as I discussed earlier, the man in the house rule in terms of welfare access. We have family court policy, right? Family court policy that is beginning to lay the strong foundation of leveraging for women in regard to child custody issues, as well as judgments on alimony, right? So this dynamic is starting to gain traction, and it's black men that feel it first, because black men are overwhelmingly poor, statistically speaking, and their feet are much closer to the ground. So these types of judgments, the impact of lack of birth control, any kind of advancement of birth control, the impact of the wars, the impact on not having access to welfare, the impact of family court judgments, these things impact poor black men definitely early on. And so strategies and tactics for responding to these situations is something that black men are discussing, but it's very much on a low level, because there are very few spaces that black men can dialogue with only other black men. So you're really talking about the barbershop, you're talking about the locker room. It's very limited. And throughout the 1980s and 90s, it really only comes about as filtered through popular pop cultural references. So, comedians like Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy. I mean, if you've seen Eddie Murphy Raw, Eddie Murphy talks about, Johnny Carson's divorce and his wife taking half. And he makes the, famous statement, "She ain't told ne'er a joke." Well, this is an important cultural moment, because black men are really kind of having a discussion through hip-hop, through comedians, through the barbershop, but they're having a discussion as filtered through these significant pop cultural moments. But it's not until we have social media that black men really begin to be able to dialogue with each other about the impact of several decades of this kind of treatment, these kinds of experiences, and how to strategize for them. The other impacts that impact black men starting from the 60s and 70s onward, of course, would be underemployment. Right, particularly in the 1970s, when we experienced deindustrialization. We have many of the factory jobs, the blue-collar work that many black men depended upon going overseas. This has a huge impact, and an expansion of the poverty levels in the ghetto. And these are areas of most urban cities that really aren't developed until World War II soldiers come back from war, take back the jobs that black men and white women had gotten only for a few years. And black women were sent, middle-class white women were sent back to the house, and black men were sent back to trying to figure it out on their own merit. And this is a time period where black men's work strategy, even as early as the third grade, is to drop out of school and work. Going back to the South, moving up to the Midwest and the North, this is the primary work strategy of black men. And this ends up working against us when college becomes the primary access point to middle-class life. But our work strategy going back to the 20s and 30s is to work as early as possible. So these things end up starting to be a problem. And this is even before the formal war on drugs. And by the time you get to the war on drugs, this has a huge impact on not only the black community, but especially black men who are trying to earn and have limited opportunities, right? In the 1970s, it's really 76 onward that we start to see the advancement of the prison industrial complex in regard to incarcerating black men in unprecedented numbers for profit. So this takes place in the 1970s. So, James Earl Jones' character in Claudine kind of comes before that era. But, these are the things that his character could look forward to. These are the kind of things that were still coming for black males. You had policies like the Rockefeller laws that had a severe impact on the incarceration rate of black males, and of course, overall negative stereotypical images in the media. So these are just a few of the cross-section of issues that dramatically impact black males. And because this is the environment that many black males are living in across the country, whether underclass, middle class, you're still dealing with these issues on one level or another. You still have a family member that's dealing with these issues on one level or another. And because these things are happening, this is the environment that black men find themselves in. And in response to that environment, you have all kinds of dynamics that begin to take place. So in this movement that I'm referring to, this movement that questions what role black men play in the country, if their consistent underemployment becomes a feature that black women tend to expect. You even hear them in the 1980s and 90s where you hear songs about if you want to, you're not going to be able to date me without a job. Where this puts the onus on black men being lazy and indifferent, when in actuality, structurally speaking, their jobs, the number of jobs available to black men are very few. So despite this mischaracterization, we're seeing it in the culture and pop culture in particular, and we're hearing about it from everyday men who are talking about the social expectations of them in relationships that they're often not able to live up to, especially if those expectations begin to traverse into the area of fantasy, where in reality, the social expectations of black men to play the role of man in America, which is often defined and has been defined by wealth, has been defined by the capacity to provide others security, is definitely a standard we see standardized and framed by white men. And so that expectation gets put on a black male group who's also at the same time grappling with the issues that are imposed on them. So this creates some tension, and in many ways hallmarks the beginning of the lowering marriage rate, the diminishing marriage rate in the black community, which in the early 1970s was extremely high. I want to say over 90%, but I will double check that. But nonetheless, by the time you get to our current moment, we have almost the exact opposite, 180 degrees, where nearly 80% of black kids are born to single parent households, and that's overwhelmingly women. So it's interesting that with the advent and the supply of birth control, that this in effect gives women control of the production of family, while at the same time men who are grappling and negotiating with society about their capacity to earn and provide security is not really adequately questioned. It's really just problematized on an individual basis. So black men become scapegoats for the black family's inability to perform and have the stability of white families, even though black men themselves are under attack. And so this dynamic, the movement I'm speaking of, is a movement in response, where black men are trying to find alternatives, trying to re-question masculinity, not necessarily trying to emulate white masculinity at all, but to address their condition and their state in society in ways that are a little different. And this affects everything from political protests to coupling, because at the end of the day, what black men find is that because they don't have the same kinds of access as others, there are things they can't take for granted. A few years ago, I had a chance to go to my Black Lives Matter protest in Los Angeles. Actually, I went to several of them. And one of the things I noticed was the very low number of men at these protests. And one protest I went to, they actually shut down an intersection, a busy intersection, and I'm trying to remember the name of the city. It's right near Long Beach, if I'm not mistaken. Excuse me, I can't remember the exact name. I haven't lived there in so long. The little areas in LA, I forget the names of. But anyway, they shut down a busy intersection near a mall. And I was there to watch, and I noticed how few black men were present. And when I did begin to approach black men afterwards and ask them about their participation in open protest, I've had several of them say, "Look, I can't do that, man. I got warrants." And I thought it was a joke, but I realized the same day I was at that protest that I had actually had a warrant for a traffic ticket that I wasn't able to pay. So I realized at that moment that many black men who are already hyper ticketed, hyper harassed, where profiling is the norm in many cities, that, availing themselves to certain types of protests can be a problem. Now, I'm not saying by any means that black men in particular shouldn't protest, but I am saying that these are the kind of things that we have to take into account. And so the absence of certain black men from such protests is not necessarily an issue of laziness or disinterest, but it might actually be an issue of strategy in some regards. And so by that, I've met many other black men who found ways to use their labor to help the community, whether coaching, whether working with kids, whether teaching. I found black men doing it in that way. But even when even professional black men find themselves vulnerable to police hyper-ticketing and arrest, that tells you something. And then, of course, we're still dealing with political issues like voter discrimination, right? So black men vote Democrat in the second highest numbers often. When you look at some of the recent elections that have taken place, it's only black women that have outvoted black men as far as the Democratic Party is concerned, but nobody's talking about how many black men are disenfranchised from their ability to vote, especially due to incarceration or past incarceration, and yet they're still voting in the second highest rates in regard to, you know, Democrats' electoral candidates, and yet nobody's talking about that. So the response by black men of voting at that second highest level, whether you agree with Democrats or not, is not really what I'm pointing to here, but just that they're doing it is part of the strategy that I'm talking about. It is a movement that does recognize a need for a political response, but a careful and measured way of doing so, taking into account the lived everyday experiences of black men who know that they're vulnerable to hyper incarceration, hyper arrest, strictly on the basis of being black men. So this is the kind of movement I'm talking to. And when I label it Black Masculinist, I'm only doing so because by giving it a name, it is my hope that we can see what black men are actually doing and have been doing for quite a while. And that is responding to their environment in the only ways they can, while trying to strategize new ways to do so. Now, by no means am I suggesting that every black man is doing this, but I am saying that when you start to look at things from a macro level and you look at the behavior of groups of people on a large enough scale, you find traits, you find tropes that are similar and point to mass, mass actions. And I think those need to be taken into account and viewed as what they are, strategy. Even when we talk about, and I do this in a blog article I wrote on why Generation X was fatherless on my blog, and basically what I was saying is that even though there's a drastic stereotype that drastically impacts black males on a negative level, as far as the whole idea of black men not being fathers, when in actuality, black men tend to be some of the best fathers in terms of the recent data coming out in the last few years, spending time with their children, so on and so forth. It's actually black males that rate the highest, despite that we ignore that for stereotypes of fatherlessness. To the extent that we have fatherlessness, much like with Ruth's character and Claudine, there are other factors that need to be taken into account. Inconsistent employment, so on and so forth. All of these things dramatically impact black men's presence, especially in families that they may or may not have wanted. We have a very dismissive way of dealing with that by saying, well, he shouldn't have had sex. And I remember people used to say the same kind of things before women had access to much greater numbers of different types of birth control, but nobody questions that now. So with the limited birth control options that men have, somehow we've made sex synonymous with parental responsibility. And that's a conservative argument, but it doesn't necessarily play out on the ground with everyday people living their lives. So, again, in terms of black male presence in the family, the statistics actually show us that it's far more participatory than black men have been given credit for. But to the extent that black men, especially in the 70s and 80s, were absent, we don't think about it as a response to family court judgment. We don't think about it as a response to the welfare state and the impact on black men, the man in the house rule. We don't think about those things as strategic responses. We think about it as black male failure, but we don't look at the conditions that black men are responding to. And those things are just a snippet of some of the areas that constitute the environment that black men are responding to. And so by the time you get to relationships, again, dating and mating strategies are shaped by the environment. And black men's dating mating strategies, in terms of pushing away from formal marriage, in terms of developing a kind of almost marital relationship without marriage. These things are not just happening because black males are hypersexual and just want sex. I mean, that's the prevailing idea in many circles. But in reality, it has everything to do with the family court and how that impacts black men. And so how do black men negotiate relationships without involving the state and potentially disrupting the entirety of their lives? I mean, for the most part, I think it's over 70% of divorces are initiated by women. So what happens if you marry, especially if she already has kids, you already have kids, and she divorces you? Well, especially if it's happening more than once, you're really talking about a reality that can become very easily unfeasible. I mean, My own stepfather is in his 70s. He's still paying back child support for a child who is a month younger than me, in his mid-40s. And the irony is his ex-wife has long since passed away, and yet he's still, as a senior citizen, paying child support. So, we're talking about lifelong sentences for decisions that other people make quite readily. And so black men's responses to this, again, we have to put into a different context and raise different questions. And we even need to look at how the relationships impact one another, right? I mean, at the end of the day, if we're looking at marriage per se, how does a couple of decades of inconsistent employment or, how does that impact how black men are perceived? Right? What kinds of attitudes and beliefs does that put on the table about black men's incapability? And these are stereotypes that are propagated in media as well. How does that shape black men and women's behavior and perceptions of each other? And black men's perceptions of themselves even, right? How do these things shape? David Data, author of The Superior Man, defines something I found very interesting. He talks about how men and women interpret love. And he says women interpret love in terms of a man's capacity to provide security and adoration for women. But he says men interpret love in terms of respect and loyalty. And what's interesting about that is if you have a population of men who, for the most part, find themselves structurally banned from being able on a mass level to provide the security that is synonymous with the very idea of manhood, what then happens to how those men are respected or have partners who are loyal to them? What does that do to the very concept of respecting men and providing loyalty? Right? And I'll tell you, across race, respect is the oxygen men breathe. And I don't mean that arbitrarily, because yeah, everybody wants respect, but I'm saying most particularly for men, respect means a great deal. And without it, one can argue there are even physiological responses that we can talk about, but we don't have the time. I will say this much, though. Again, in relationships, if men function and interpret love on the basis of respect and loyalty, but they're structurally blocked from being able to play the role that men play to generally garner respect and loyalty, particularly from women, but also from family in general, what happens over decades to relationships? And so this is kind of what begins, what we can talk about in terms of this Black Masculinist movement, this movement of men who are looking at, if they're going to marry at all, doing so in very creative and different kinds of ways, mainly because they're blocked from being able to play the role that other men are able to play on different terms. So we're talking about, informal marriages, living together. Like California is not a common law state, so you might find men and women living together because, if it's common law, you find yourself subject to the same marital problems in family court that you would if you had a formal marriage. All of these dynamics in many ways shape what men experience. And we haven't even gotten to men's experiences with intimate partner violence and with sexual assault and rape. And the data shows us that in terms of sexual assault and rape, that the CDC in particular did a study that was prioritized and made into an article on time.com, and they talked about how the data shows us that the rates are almost the same in terms of sexual assault and rape against or toward men as victims, as they are as initiators. And black men in particular, especially when you factor in incarceration and the different concepts for explaining and understanding men's experience with sexual assault and rape, that black men in particular experience it at much higher rates, right? And even in terms of intimate partner violence, the rates show that intimate partner violence is bidirectional, meaning that the violence initiated by men toward women and women toward men is almost equal. And again, remember that men haven't had 40 to 50 years of social training about being victims and what to do if victimized. In other words, when you have the development of domestic shelters for women who had been battered, it actually took time to train women on what it meant to be battered and how to use domestic shelters. Well, men didn't get that training, nor are there shelters for men. I mean, the closest thing to shelters for men are prisons. So at the end of the day, when men have not had the opportunity to have that kind of social training that prioritizes them, that lets them know that they have a place to go, what you end up having is no response at all. So in that, what I'm pushing for with Black masculinism is to first put all of those issues on the table. There needs to be an addressing of grievances. There needs to be an articulation. And this is, again, something that most men across race even, but especially Black men, have not had the opportunity to do, to even develop a vocabulary to explain these situations, explain the context, explain the experiences. They haven't had a chance to. We didn't have, what you saw, for example, with feminism, was that for the most part it was influenced by its access in university systems, right? And this is what I experienced in my education, from 92 to 2007. I had at every campus I'd been to an older Black feminist who would teach classes on said feminism and would filter it through whatever other subjects they were teaching. So I got years of it. I read the Patricia Hill Collins. I read the Bell Hooks works. I read a series of, of scholarship regarding women articulating their experiences, and this scholarship made its way into popular culture, especially in the 1980s, by the time you get to the Oprah Winfrey era and so on and so forth. And so they got a chance to articulate those out and relate the vocabulary to the experiences of women, but Black men didn't. Black men articulated their experiences through pop culture to a degree and through hip hop, but again, we're talking about young men rapping in a studio versus, women who are coming through with graduate degrees. So it's a very different articulation. And so with that, there are many men that haven't really had a chance to develop that vocabulary and make sense of what's going on and realize how many other men share their experiences. And that's one of the things that I'm seeking to do. So the first step to me, in terms of what a Black masculinist movement looks like, is to first acknowledge that, one, there's already been a movement of Black men responding to conditions, because that's what movements do. So it's already happening. It's not something that I'm necessarily directing. I'm merely pointing to the fact that it's been happening. And the second thing I think that needs to happen is the development of a vocabulary, so we actually can make sense and articulate what it is. So as you know, we come here on the Onyx Report every first and third Wednesday. And I will continue this discussion, sometimes with guests, sometimes without. But it is to also develop this vocabulary so that more and more men are empowered on how to articulate what they're experiencing, what needs to be going on, what needs to be discussed, and what isn't. Right? And really making sure people understand what various types of victimization Black men find themselves subject to that nobody wants to talk about. Right? We sweep under the rug, and if we acknowledge it, we may discuss it as a Black problem, but we really need to be more specific, because specificity seems to be the order of the day, and it's okay for everybody else to be specific. But if we talk about Black men being specific, I've even heard academics charging Black men with absorbing too much of the conversation. But yet again, whatever conversation is happening, and I think it's nowhere near as much as there needs to be, these Black men are not finding their conditions being changed by it. So anyway, thank you for joining us on the Onyx Report with Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, and look out for us in the beginning of November. First episode will be November 6th, Wednesday, 5 p.m. Pacific. I'll see you then. Peace.